Hello everyone, my name is Katie and welcome back to my channel. So today is Metal Monday, and today I thought I would talk about 10 metal albums that I consider a 10 out of 10. These are all albums that I think have no skips, are perfect all the way through. Not necessarily all of my favorite albums of all time are on this list, but a lot of the ones on the list could definitely be intertwined with a favorites of all time list. It's a little bit confusing, but you know, some of my favorite albums aren't necessarily a 10, but these are the albums that get a perfect score from me all around the board. So let's get started. So the first metal album that is a 10 out of 10 for me is Black Sabbath's Master of Reality. I do think this is the best Black Sabbath album out of their entire catalog. It's not necessarily my personal favorite. My personal favorite is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, and you could really argue that a lot of their albums are 10s out of 10, but I think Master of Reality is truly their best album. It defines what I envision when I think of Black Sabbath. They sort of created a lot of genres with this album. We got like the doom metal, stoner metal, sludge metal. A lot of things stemmed from this album alone. This album sort of feels like the fuck it era of Black Sabbath. The lyrics have a lot of like straightforward meanings. For example, Sweet Leaf, it's not so metaphorical. It's not metaphorically talking about drugs. It's like straightforward, like, we love weed. It's kind of funny, but it like embodies what metal really is. This like, I don't give a shit attitude, outlaw attitude, go against the norm sort of thing. It's pretty much just a no bullshit album. And then when you talk about the music, it's down-tuned, so it just feels heavier. And at the time that it came out, this wasn't as common of a practice. I feel like Black Sabbath changed from more of like a classic rock sound to sort of creating metal in these like second, third, fourth albums. I could listen to this album a million times over. Songs like Children of the Grave and Sweet Leaf are amazing, and it's one of those albums that it can either be background noise for me or something where I just put on my headphones and focus on every bit of it. No skips. I think the entire album goes together perfectly. And it has so many of those like melancholic and just dreadful, depressing riffs that you see more later on in music. And I think Black Sabbath inspired that a lot, specifically on this album. The next 10 out of 10 album is Obituary, Cause of Death. Okay, it's one of my favorite death metal albums of all time. We'll get to another band later on in the video, but this is one of those staples for me. It just feels so raw and aggressive. John Tardy's vocals are so just like unpolished, and I kind of like the older days in death metal and black metal where the vocals weren't necessarily like this technique that had been practiced a lot, and it's almost like they're screaming in like an improper way, but it just sounds so real. It doesn't sound so much like a career path necessarily for these vocalists. It's like a real raw scream from the soul. I like when it's not so perfect like today's music, like Lorna Shore or something like that. Like, it takes a lot of talent to do that, but what John Tardy did felt the most real. Same thing with the guitar solos. I feel like the solos on this album, you can hear imperfections here and there, but sometimes I actually prefer that to like super perfected produced music. It feels like you're kind of watching the band on stage, and it feels like a real band playing. The guitar tone on this album is so gritty and dirty. Oof, unmatched. I think this is the most distinguishable of Obituary's albums. Most people like Slowly We Rot more, but this one's actually my personal favorite. It's a really balanced album because it has like complex tempo changes, but then it gets balanced out by the slow and heavy riffs. So your brain's not constantly doing this work trying to hear everything. It gives you time to breathe and slow down in between it all, and it remains heavy regardless if the tempo is fast or slow or whatever. They perfected the art of relying on sound more than tempo to remain heavy. This album is really, to me, Florida death metal defined. Like, when I think of Florida death metal, I think of Obituary, I think of this album. My next 10 out of 10 album is Opeth's Blackwater Park. This album came out years ago, and still to this day, there is nothing quite like it. I haven't been able to find anything like it. I found things inspired by it, but nothing feels quite the same. It's such a genre bending album that it feels weird to just call it a metal album. It's definitely a ton of other things mixed together. As corny as it sounds, this album is truly a spiritual journey. Like, for me, it's not something I just throw on as background noise. Like, when I listen to this album, I listen to it. It's what I call a headphone song. Once again, it's something you put your headphones in, You focus on every bit of it. It genuinely feels like something written straight from the soul, and Michael's voice feels so just real. It feels like this album wasn't made to impress anyone or necessarily to make money or get fame. It just feels like someone writing music and playing music straight from the heart just because there's a passion for it, and that's it. It's poetic in a sense, it's like atmospheric. A lot of it is really balanced, like you have these super quiet moments and it knows when it needs to be quiet and then when it needs to be heavy and aggressive. So you kind of like have these build up moments where you know it's going to get heavier, you're going to hear some screaming, and then it slows down and becomes kind of like acoustic and relaxing, and it's literal therapy. This is one of those bands that definitely is not just a metal band. They are so much more than that, so far beyond that, that it feels insulting just to call them that. So I've never really, I guess you could just say progressive metal, whatever. But this is definitely a one-of-a-kind album. Next up is Epicus Doomicus Metallicus from Candlemass. I love Candlemass, okay? First of all, I'm just a very, like, dramatic, theatrical person when it comes to the content that I consume, like music, movies, whatever. I love just, like, this over-the-top, dramatic, melancholic feel. And Candlemass has that perfectly, especially on this album. Messiah's vocals are just so, like, drawn out, and, like, it could be something that you hear on the stage, like it could be in the Phantom of the Opera or something. It's slow and heavy. I do like my slow stuff. I'm not really sure why. I almost feel like slow is heavier than fast a lot in metal. Some people don't feel that way, but it gives you more time to really feel it. You got these blues-based riffs that are just like raw and slow, and they're heavy on your chest. I live for that. In a way, I kind of feel like Candlemass took that doom metal blueprint that Sabbath created, and they kind of perfected it, at least for my personal taste. Like, if you ask me to mention a straight up doom metal album, it's gonna be this one. The entire thing sort of feels like this medieval fantasy journey. It's kind of like a world building album. It doesn't feel like something that was meant to be taken completely literally. It's perfect for people like me that are just way over the top and like to be dramatic. Next up is The Sound of Perseverance by Death. Now, this is my personal favorite Death album. I feel like you could argue that all of Death's albums are 10 out of 10, no skip, perfect things. Like, I always say that anything that Chuck Schuldiner touched turned to gold, and I mean that. Like, I have never listened to anything from Death or Control Denied that I didn't like. It's because of Chuck as the mastermind, and it's weird because this is Death's last album before Chuck's passing, and I feel so much emotion when thinking about this album, definitely when listening to it. It just feels like this powerful, passionate, emotional album, especially with the songs like Voice of the Soul. There's just so much like feeling connected to it. It is my favorite of Chuck's vocals. I liked when he leaned more into like the high pitch, like screeching. Like, think about that opening scream on the Painkiller cover. Holy crap. I think Painkiller is one of the only covers of a song that I like more than the original. I think Death did it perfectly. I feel like this was just a point in Chuck Schuldiner's career and life that he didn't necessarily have to prove himself. He didn't have to be the heaviest or whatever. It's still a heavy album, don't get me wrong. Very complex. You guys know how Death is. It's just like super technical and all of that. But like I said, it was just a time that Death had been reinvented so many times with so many lineup changes, and Chuck had gotten to a point where he was like well experienced. I feel like he knew what he wanted to make on this album. He just randomly like spit things out from his soul and it turned into an album. That's what it feels like to me, at least. And in such a bittersweet way, it feels like a goodbye album from Chuck. And it's one of the only ones that I listen to very frequently. I do like Symbolic a lot and like Scream Bloody Gore, but something about The Sound of Perseverance just hits me in the soul. And I will say, Spirit Crusher is probably my favorite death metal song of all time. The next 10 out of 10 album is Opus Eponymous by Ghost. Now, I know a lot of people argue that Ghost isn't a metal band, and I understand that argument because a lot of their stuff isn't metal. This first album, I feel like, is pretty much solidly metal in the way that like Black Sabbath or Merciful Fate was, you know, those early days of metal. That's how I see it. but I do want to include it on this list because Ghost literally is my favorite band. Like, they're definitely up there in like a top 3 situation for me. This album feels so simple yet effective. Every riff is like so memorable. It's not super complex and technical to the point where you have no idea what you're hearing. It's very just simple, straightforward. This is actually Tobias Forge's like brain put into an album because he was the mastermind behind this album. He wrote everything. I'm pretty sure he recorded most, if not all, of the instruments. I will have to fact check that, but this is pretty much a one-man band situation on this first album. He said that he was at a point in his life where he had just had twins and he was newly married and they needed more money, and he had been in and out of bands for years and it just wasn't really working out for him. He did come from Repugnant, where he was the lead singer, well, vocalist. He went under the stage name Mary Gore, and he played the lead guitar in that band, and I really like the one album that he put out with that band. But just using that as an example, he had been in a lot of bands before and never could make it into a career. He said the only ambitions he ever had was to play music and nothing else. So this was like his last ditch effort around 2009, and I'm so shocked by how good this album is from one person's brain. It's got these super catchy melodic choruses. He said he was inspired a lot by like Merciful Fate and Iron Maiden. This album sounds straight out of the 60s or 70s. Like, if you told someone that didn't know Ghost that this was a 70s rock album, like Blue Oyster Cult type of era, they would probably believe you. The album feels eerie. It has a little bit of a doom vibe to it, but then you have these like catchy, almost pop-like choruses to balance it all out, and overall it feels fun to me. A lot of the lyrics are based on like old myths, and a lot of times it's like spooky satanic themes and stuff. There's songs about like Elizabeth Bathory, which that's a whole backstory. Just a lot of good storytelling throughout. I love so many riffs from this album. My favorite one is the Death Knell riff with the bell in it. Oh my god. This is definitely a no skip for me, and probably my most frequently listened to Ghost album. Considering they're one of my favorite bands and I like every album they've put out, it says a lot that their first one was the best one. They did get less and less metal over the years, which isn't a problem for me per se, because I like other genres of music like rock, and they've even dabbled into glam rock territory these days. I don't mind that, but I do love going back to this first album and appreciating this just raw and simple metal. And next up we have Avenge Sevenfold's self-titled album. So growing up for me, from the age of probably like 11 to 17, 18, this was my favorite band. I followed them endlessly. Literally, I went to so many of their shows and knew every word to every song on every album. And it took me years to really figure out what I think their best album is. My personal favorite is not the same as the one that's on this list. I think Self-Titled is objectively their best album. It was sort of the album that defined their sound. I think the sound from this album is usually what people think of when they think of Avenged Sevenfold. This is the album that really made them take off. City of Evil did okay commercially, but this was the one where they just blew up. There were music videos everywhere, and this is when they really became more commonly known. I think this album had the Rev's best work on it. Like, he wrote so many of the songs, and he had the best drum work on this album. He even had some background vocals, and actually the whole band did. If you go watch the making of series, you can see all the layers they added in production of all the vocal harmonies and sound effects and whatever else to make it just feel so alive. On this one, they leaned heavily into the guitar harmonies. They did it before on previous albums, but this one has a lot of that in songs like Afterlife and Almost Easy. I've always loved harmonizing guitars. That's always been one of my favorite things in music. They too have the catchy choruses with the nice melodies. Like, it almost feels like pop metal in a way. As pop as metal could get without not sounding like metal or metalcore, or I don't really know the genre of this band, I'm gonna be honest. But I feel like they kind of perfected that catchy pop sound without being too mainstream. Not to mention, this album has the track A Little Piece of Heaven, and that is my favorite Avenged Sevenfold song ever. I think it's their most creative. It's genuinely their magnum opus. It's kind of like their version of Bohemian Rhapsody. I think that it's definitely their best song. Like I said, it's not my personal favorite. I think my top favorite would be Waking the Fallen. Second would probably be Nightmare. But objectively speaking, this one is perfect, no skips. Even songs like Brompton Cocktail Dear God. There was one other one. I actually think those songs fit really well and balance out the album. So I've always enjoyed the entire thing all the way through. And next we have none other than System of a Down's Toxicity. Now, I genuinely mean this when I say I have never became sick and tired of this album. Never. I don't think you could ever turn this album on and me not get excited. Like, I could listen to it over and over forever. I have since I was a kid, and it hits the same every time. It's aggressive. It has this powerful political message. It's just anarchy put into music. It has the weird, just off the wall sound that only System of a Down can really perfect to me. A lot of people call it nu metal or alternative metal. I almost want to call it experimental metal because you got some weird stuff in there. You have a lot of those beautiful melodies and vocal harmonies that they're kind of known for. I think Serge and Darren's voices go together so perfectly, like match made in heaven. If you asked me my favorite System of a Down songs, I think most of them would come from this album. Songs like Aerials and Forest and Psycho, and then of course you got like Chop Suey, which is their most popular song and probably their best. This is the System of a Down defining album. I really do like Hypnotize and Mesmerize. I know a lot of people don't really like those albums. I think those are great. But Toxicity is probably my personal favorite. System of a Down was kind of my first metal or metal adjacent band as a kid, so I hope it's not too much of a nostalgia thing for me. But I am shocked that to this day I don't get tired of this album or this band, when a lot of times if I go back and listen to something I liked as a kid, I'm like, why did I like this? But I don't feel that way about this one. I actually think I've grown to appreciate them more as I've gotten older. I can understand the messages behind the songs now and sort of understand what's going on. As a kid, I just thought it was loud and crazy. But now I genuinely feel the passion from Serge and Darren, and that they really cared about what they were singing about in the songs. So this is the second to last album, and it's gonna be Megadeth, Rust in Peace. Okay, this might be my favorite metal album of all time. I probably should have saved it for the #1 spot, but you'll see why I didn't. But genuinely, this is the best. Megadeth is one of my favorite bands, and I think this was the best lineup they ever had, with Nick Menza on the drums and Marty Friedman on lead guitar. Like, they absolutely had this magical lineup for the first time ever in Megadeth history. First, let's talk about the sound. I think the guitar tone is Megadeth's guitar tone throughout their entire catalog. I think Dave's voice is the most fun on this album. Like, sometimes I like something from Countdown to Extinction better, but something about his voice on Rust in Peace is so full of character, and it's a little nasally, but it's fun, and I love a weird voice with thrash metal. The songs had fun concepts, like the cover art, and the song Hangar 18 is based on this conspiracy theory about like an alien being found somewhere in the desert in a hangar, whatever. I'm pretty sure I saw in an interview that Nick Menza was like really obsessed with that theory at the time of writing this album, which is so funny. We have so many good guitar solos on this album between Marty and Dave. Think of a song like Lucretia, like they both have solos in that song, kind of like a back and forth situation. Oh, it's so good. And like Holy Wars, Holy Wars is genuinely one of the best metal songs of all time. I think it's most definitely the best Megadeth song. Freaking Tornado of Souls. Genuinely a no-skip album. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Could listen to it endlessly forever and ever. It's one of those albums that I go back to very frequently. Like, there's so many new things coming out in the world, and I find myself going back to this album a lot. It's overall just a really fun album. I genuinely just have fun when I listen to this and catch myself smiling, and I love when music can do that. And last but not least, on my metal albums that are at 10 out of 10 would be Metallica, Master of Puppets. Now, I saved this for the #1 spot because this might be the best metal album ever made, objectively. Hear me out. It's a Metallica defining album. Like, if you asked me who is Metallica, I would show you this album. It's not my personal favorite. My personal favorite is Injustice for All, but I do think Master of Puppets is more balanced and has a little bit of everything that Metallica is good at, all in one. First, you have that just menacing intro riff with Battery. So you know you're starting off strong, and that one is just one of the best thrash songs ever made. And then we have the title track, which is definitely Metallica's best song. the way that I said this album is Metallica defining, so is the song Master of Puppets. Everything that Metallica is good at and really well known for is all put into this one song. You have the super fast and thrashy aggressive moments, you have like the slower interludes, you have a bluesy like solo from James, and then you have just an absolute shredding whammy bar solo from Kirk Hammett, and it's just everything Metallica is good at all in one. The Thing That Should Not Be is a good example of just like a slow and heavy badass song. I think Metallica has always been really good at that with things like For Whom the Bell Tolls, and the Black Album is very slow. I like when they slow it down in between all the thrashiness. Sanitarium, aka Welcome Home, is an excellent ballad slash slow sad song. We always need at least one of those on a Metallica album. Leper Messiah, Damage Incorporated, all great like faster thrash songs, but the masterpiece here is Orion. Orion is the best Metallica instrumental, and it feels like Cliff's soul put into a song. And this was the last album with Cliff Burton, so it's like a bittersweet goodbye, kind of like the Chuck Schuldiner situation earlier. I just feel like this was a great way, this album was a great way to end an era with Metallica, knowing that Cliff wouldn't be around anymore. It's just one of those things looking back that I'm like, thank God they made that before everything changed. So that's all for my list of 10 out of 10 albums. Let me know in the comments down below what you agree and disagree with, and what other albums do you consider a 10 out of 10. I'm thinking about doing a part 2 to this because I'm already thinking of other albums that would go on this list. So let me know by liking this video if that's something you're interested in. And also don't forget to subscribe for future videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!